You are listening to a podcast from The Hindu.
Mount Everest ain't got on me, 'cause I'm on top of the world. I'm on top of the world. Yeah.
This is our second episode where we are discussing from where we left off regarding the travails and the very exciting journey of the Great Trigonometric Survey. And what we had discussed last time was how this was India's original big data project and pretty much arguably the first instance of big science in India.
We left you at William Lambton's deathbed, somewhere in Wardha district, Maharashtra. And we take the story from there with his successor, George Everest.
I am Jacob Koshy.
And I'm Sobhana Nair, and this is the
Rearview. Here we dive into the history of things, events, discoveries, and inventions. Matters had gone badly for the 28-year-old lieutenant from the start. Barely a month into his first season in the field, he had been confronted by a mutiny. The infliction of corporal punishment is an odious task, he noted. But it was either that or abandoning the assignment. His escort obviously knew the perils of the monsoonal jungle and had seized every chance of escaping from the camp back to the city of Hyderabad. Something had to be done. Not without misgivings, the lieutenant ordered one of these defaulters to be thrashed, whereupon the whole troop, about 40 in number, took up their weapons and announced that they would decamp en masse. The British bluff had been called. In this insignificant and still today unfashionable corner of the subcontinent, the myth of empire was at stake. So Shobna, the lieutenant that was mentioned in this passage, who very cruelly rounded up a whole lot of his subordinates or who were helping him in the task, they were thrashed and beaten. This lieutenant is, as you mentioned, George. And here's a drum roll from where we promised you last time. George Everest.
Everest. That sounds horrible.
Well, apparently, we've all since childhood and schools and every reference, we've always referred to him as Everest, as in rhyming with cleverest. But it is Everest because that's how his family name goes. And even today in the survey of India, we read that if you actually were to go and ask for George Everest's belongings or some insight into his work, even today, contemporary Surveyor General of India will actually point out to you the correct pronunciation of his name. And apparently, he was very picky, touchy about the way his name was pronounced. And as we know, he was such a kind, gentle, and sensitive soul.
Absolutely, absolutely. He was so kind and so gentle, Jacob, that he just out of the goodness of his heart decided to flog his fellow colleagues. George Everest was born on 4th July 1790. And this episode and the previous one, we are talking about the surveyors. George Everest was destiny's own child, as we shall see. He was always meant to be a surveyor, considering the fact that he was baptized at a church in Greenwich.
Wow, what are the chances of that? I mean, that's where the longitudinal meridian works. I've actually been there, Shobna, like 10 years back. And it's surrounded by this very vast expanse of very English pasture kind of fields. You can actually take a beer and just sit in the sun over there. And there is this raised platform which has got these towers, and there is this entire line where they actually tell you that this is where the Greenwich Meridian Time or GMT. And now, of course, in the because the British Empire no longer exists, it is the marker of the Universal Time Coordinated, the UTC. Did we refer to this in our episode on time, right? I
Yes,
believe.
yes, yes. It
So
is
anyway,
this. It is the zero from which they calculated all longitudinal distances. And it has been the venue of England's Royal Observatory since the 17th century. Uh, and it was in the 19th century that the world sort of it gained the international approval, and Greenwich Mean Time would be established as the world standard. Everest went to Royal Military Academy, where he studied mathematics, mechanics, and measuring techniques essential for an officer joining the artillery. And as you just read out the passage, at 16, he joined East India Company, and he had come here to India. Everest's first season as a surveyor. And in fact, surveyors, interestingly, back then used to be derisively called the compasswalas. And his first season as the compasswala ended in disaster because out of 150 people in his team, 15 died, wrecked by fevers.
And we saw in our previous, when we were discussing Lambton, the real risks involved because you're traversing through jungle, through desert, through hostile lands, you're crossing deadly rivers, and malaria is perennial, is it's always in the air. Most of India is swampy, especially these parts where they're traversing. So it's almost like a given that, apparently more people have died during the course of the Great Survey than in any reasonable war that has actually been fought in this subcontinent. If you take it as a total, so it was quite arduous work.
Can you imagine? And yet, here we don't talk probably enough about this exercise. And I don't remember from my history textbook or geography textbooks where a significant amount of time was
Not at all, because as we see, these both Lambton and even Everest were people who were largely forgotten, though they had
except
laid out this.
there's very difficult to forget Everest.
Yeah,
Everest.
and I guess all those people whom he really troubled have also passed on, and yeah,
Going back to our book that we have, which has provided the guardrails for these two episodes. It has extensively John Key's The Great Arc. Uh, the book has extensively quoted Everest. I'm sorry, I will continue calling him Everest. I cannot, for the
I
life of
refuse.
me.
I'm going to be like that. I want to point it out to you, like that person who called him Compasswala.
Even if at the risk of Mr. Everest's ghost haunting me, I will call him Everest anyhow. So as I was saying, John Key's book extensively quotes from his reports and correspondence, and then John Key writes, judged by his reports and correspondence, George Everest may have been the most cantankerous sahib ever to have stalked the Indian stage. His pen spat venom. Each of his innumerable subordinate clauses was baited with sarcasm and barbed for maximum injury.
And knowing him, those insubordinates actually would mean those people who were his subordinates, and not in the way I guess Key was referring to as grammatical insubordinate clauses.
John Key is absolutely on the point here because in 1980, sorry, um, 1823, on Lambton's death, when Everest takes over the organization, there was a revolt. All the people who worked for Lambton did not approve of Everest's ways, and he was quite derisive about his uh,
Attitudes
subordinates.
towards. In
Yeah.
fact, there's this saying, quote attributed to him: "The natives of India, according to Everest, with and I begin quotes with their minds bowed down under the incubus of superstition, attributed all fevers to witchcraft and ignored natural causes." So it's quite ironical because the he would say that Indians were ignorant and superstitious, and that was the causes of all their fevers. In his mind, he thought that the fevers were caused by a poisonous influence in the air. I mean, that was the classic definite reasoning given for malaria, right? derives from the word, and that's goes all the way back to the Roman understanding of what causes malaria. So ironically, he was as ignorant as the other Indians, and it was only it would take about 60 or 70 years later after Ronald Ross comes in and connects malaria to the Anopheles mosquito. So this was a sort of guy, he actually thought that Indians were
When Jacob speaks, my dear listeners, he's leaving around beautiful Easter eggs. Like he casually mentions about Ronald Ross and malaria. Maybe that's another episode.
that's definitely a future.
How do we know? Yeah.
So yeah, so this was the kind of person, and I guess what particularly galled people was the fact that the kind of contrast he bore with Lambton, because Lambton was somebody, as we discussed earlier, he seemed to be unperturbed by the weather. And
He was so focused on his work that it the people, the politics, the weather, the ants, the snakes, and the worldly creatures kind of didn't matter to him.
these are people who have come from Scotland, and that climate, that weather, they are transported into a different era, different geography entirely. And you have somebody like Lambton. It is Lambton who is exceptional in the case that he's unlike the average Englishman, who is kind of seems to be unperturbed by circumstance. So I think that is the exceptional way.
What basically you're saying is being mildly racist is absolutely
No,
fine.
not the racism, of course. It's
Yeah,
basically
absolutely fine.
being
It's
unbothered by
par
the
for the
weather.
course.
Being
Yeah.
unbothered by the weather. I mean, that's exceptional. I mean, I start complaining. Even you start complaining when it gets too hot. Our
I
ACs
don't know.
just
Between
break
you and
down
me,
for a bit.
Jacob, the only person who complains is you.
Anyway, I mean, I
Getting
could
back
reference
on
that.
track. Getting back on track. On taking charge of the survey, he found the most northern work to be a baseline measured at Takalkhera in the valley of Berar. But the triangulation had not been extended so far. Here, Everest commenced work in November 1823. Berar is in present day Amravati region, Maharashtra. He carried the line over Satpura range. He worked for another 2 years, bringing the triangulation till Sironj in present day Vidisha district, but had to take a break and return to England to recuperate from the multiple bouts of fever that wrecked his body. So it seems to be a recurrent theme in Everest's life. Remember when he had first joined the Great Trigonometrical Survey under Lambton, he had to take a break and he had to go back to recuperate.
Maybe if he was born in 2025, this would be considered as taking self-care or mental health breaks.
You
But
cannot
anyway, he just had to keep going back and back. And imagine how irritating it is to go on a ship, recuperate, come back, and then again
fall
fall
sick.
sick. Have be susceptible to all of these fevers.
So, and by the way, his recuperation or self care, as you put, goes on for nearly 4 or 5 years,
Yeah, a
because
long time.
he returns only in 1830, and with him he brings a bigger theodolite. I hope you guys remember theodolite. We did talk about it in detail in the
So just
previous
to call back,
episode.
a theodolite is what these surveyors used to measure the elevations of peaks, to measure the angles of triangular kind of display. The differences between two angles. All these measurements of angles and heights and elevations required this huge instrument called the theodolite, and that is essential to all kinds of surveying and mapping work.
So in 1832, Colonel Everest resumed the work connected with the Meridional Arc series. Now he encounters the trouble, the difficult country, the valley of Chambal, the citadel of dacoits. But scarier still for the compasswalas, the flat land. For no prospect of high vantage points, which was obviously a very scary prospect.
So Shobna, here is this very sickly but irascible kind of surveyor general who you obviously think very highly of. But
Very, very highly.
let's give a physical picture of how he actually looks. So at 32, he was younger than when Lambton had launched a survey. And there's no real portrait of him, but there's only a pen drawing dated 1843. And this is, and I'm quoting what John Key would say, described this. He appears to have retained the Olympian profile of an ambitious youth. That's very revealing, I must say. Black hair, close cropped, surmounts the cloudless brow. A frigid stare. See, what a friendly guy. A frigid stare complements the long cornice of a nose. See, he doesn't have a great nose. And I know that you have one for good noses, right?
Good noses, yes.
So that's immediately the downer for you. Glimpse looming by lamplight over the circle of the great theodolite, he may have looked a towering figure. Yet his stature was modest, and the imperious brow was belied by a tight mouth and an irrelevant chin. Mutton chop whiskers only emphasized these deficiencies, and in old age would be allowed to encroach across them, smothering his low face in a tangle of beard. Then, too, lionized by the scientific establishment, he would grow his hair into a mane and thus reward an 1860s photographer with a suitably leonine aspect. As for the lion's roar, he already had it.
Can you imagine?
That's a gentle cat for you. So that is the major challenge. I mean, you always needed some hillocks or hills where you could get an uninterrupted sight of another peak. But flatland is a challenge. Now, here's where Everest, and here I go in, Everest sort of genius would come in. The trigonometric survey so far was all about doing things in the daytime because to find the appropriate distances. This also meant that when monsoons came, you had to stop all of your surveying, you go on this recluse. But this guy thought, Everest thought, let's innovate and make these measurements in the night. So first he improvised on the use of specialized flares and lamps. And one great thing about this was in the night when you are shown off the daytime brightness, you are also able to get you can look further and you can get a clearer view of any object. Your sunlight tends to refract, I mean, especially during the daytime, and it can actually alter your perception of where a particular object is. But in the night, this is kind of obviated. So he set up these stars, and these stars weren't expensive, and it was much cheaper than the traditional apparatus that they would use. And so in the night, you could actually set up these viewing posts. He also improvised on using telegraph towers. And remember, telegraph was this emerging technology by then. So that time you had a few telegraph towers which were actually put where you could send short messages. So improvise on them and use them as elevated sighting points from which you could make measures. He also pioneered the use of grid irons rather than using these long chains, which Lambton was lugging around. And he used these things called compensation bars. And their mechanics works by, they are more tolerant to the expansion and contraction that you get from heat. So these made a more permanent structure. You had an entire grid iron structures. And in fact, if you look at the modern way how the Survey of India uses it, they use GPS based finders on several of these existing towers. So the idea that there would be a fixed star somewhere is in originates from Everest's application of them, and it still resonates today in how the Survey of India measures it. So using this, he actually was able to, the survey was able to even conceive of going beyond the flatlands, could extend into the Gangetic plains, and eventually towards, towards the Himalayas.
Yeah. But while Everest was doing all this, by 1835, he had fallen ill again. and this time the doctors declare that it is nearly hopeless for him. In September 1837, the Court of Directors appointed Major Jervis, an engineer officer who had been engaged in some of the surveys in the Bombay Presidency, to succeed Colonel Everest as Surveyor General in the event of his death, to ensure that the work should not be impeded. And that was enough impetus for our charitable, kind hearted, beautiful minded Everest to jump out of his sick bed. Major Jervis never had hope anyway. There was no way that Everest would be
So that sheer element
rotating.
of the insecurity of losing his position, again, so much in contrast to Lambton. So what actually propelled him to get better? And there are these very, I mean, to me, it seems very hilarious instances of how, even though he was sickly, he would actually take the help of a couple of men who would then haul him up by two of his by his arms, and then have him stand up, and then he would go to the theodolite or something and make a measurement. I mean, that's commitment, wouldn't you
Absolutely,
agree?
absolutely. We have to appreciate the man, and he's still standing tall.
Very much, with a leonine mane,
Leonine Main, and we will come
barking
to
orders at
his.
everybody and getting mutinied.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
So he takes position again. And over time, now the survey has become a very institutional structure. It's no longer just a set of guys for the past several decades have just been traveling across India with chains. Now they hacked the East India Company has obviously spread its tentacles far more expansively, and there are districts to be conquered. There are, I don't know, revenue lands to be mapped. And remember, at the end of it, these two sign. I mean, what is common to both Lambton and Everest is that sense of geekery around both of them. They were both really interested in this exercise to determine the shape of the Earth. They were less interested in practical things like mapping it for revenue land, though that was a story. And even that's what scientists generally do. They want stuff to be done, but they know the funds lie elsewhere, so they spin stories to the powers that be on how this is useful. So the British actually wanted a far more institutionalized structure, and that's how you actually have the Survey of India that is established. And because the might of government is in Calcutta, you have the surveys offices actually established over there. And as we also mentioned last time, the survey has two parts. One is you are actually traversing, making measurements, and one is making the immense calculations, the
Calculations,
data that you
yes.
have gathered. You have people, and this is where we have references to the first computers.
Yes, and I will again tell you to pause because we'll come to that. We'll come to that. I know you're excited about that. But Everest, the main credit goes to Everest in organizing
Yes.
the putting the house in order and making it more
So there are two things.
bureaucrat.
There is one, the surveyor of the trigonometric survey, and there is also the surveyor general of
And
India, and
also,
he's both.
isn't Everest responsible for putting, despite opposition, severe opposition from the East India Company bosses, of putting the surveyor office in somewhere in Dehradun?
So that's what I mean. They also, so he, by this time they had realized that they could actually, because of all these other methods of towers, etc., they could actually not just restrict themselves to the plains. They could go towards the Himalayan peaks, and those are the challenging locations. They could scale the peaks, find out different locations, and that's eventually how he traversed up and came to Missouri, and in Missouri landed upon this
Hathi Paon.
idyllic spot called Hathi Pao. And coincidentally, I was just there last month, and it was, you can actually see his house. I mean, when I visited about 10 years back, it was completely run down. It was there were just walls, and it was in that state for several decades. There have always been plans to kind of renovate it and make it into a museum or of memorabilia. But this time when I went, they've actually made it, though it costs $200 just to enter that Hathi Pao, and it's
Hallowed
expensive, hallowed ground.
hotels. Huh.
but it's nice. I mean, they've got several of Everest's instruments. You can actually see some of those vantage points that he probably would have stood and stared out and trying to catch views of the various major Himalayan peaks, grumbling about the weather,
And
and
the
the
people.
people and
Yeah.
the he had a lot of these workshops that were there. Over time, there were also changes in technology in terms of it was no longer the old theodolite. You had sectors, and you had to actually fashion a lot of instruments to measure mountains.
So Everest's great achievement is bringing up the survey from, remember where we started. We started from the burning plains of Madras, and now we have reached the foothills of Himalaya. And it is very significant because it is from here that the survey will scale the very heights that we are talking about,
And the thing that eventually gave him his name.
which sort of made him immortal. So finally, Everest returned to England in 1844. He retired, and interestingly, a year later, at the very young age of 55 years, he married Emma Wing, Wing with an H, who was less than half his age. The two had 6 children, and he was still active in the Royal Geographical Society. But why his story doesn't end here. In fact, it's just beginning in many ways, because the great thing about the Great Trigonometrical Survey is that whether each of these people who headed the survey, whether they liked uh, their fellow beings or the atmosphere around, they always like their bosses, which is so
The
rare.
interesting thing here is that Everest himself was not really interested in the actually computing the heights of peaks, etc. I mean, there were other people in the survey, right? And people who were taking an interest in the peaks started to wonder whether the Himalayan peaks were actually taller than the ones in South America itself, because the received wisdom of that time was that it was the mountains of the Andes that were the tallest in the world. And the way the Himalayas looked, they looked tall, but they didn't seem as imposing and tall. So there was always these speculations. And even prior to Everest, there were people who had made educated, informed guesses based on what they knew. And voices were already emerging that probably these Himalayan peaks were actually the tallest in the world. There was a lot of dispute in Britain, when some of these members of they were actually officers of the East India Company. As we discussed last time, they clearly seem to have a lot of time
Time
on
on
their
their
hands.
hands, yeah.
I mean, officially they were supposed to be part of, I don't know, the equivalents of collecting revenue and taxes, but they had so much time on their hand,
And if they
especially
didn't die, that is if they didn't die early
you
of
had the William
various
Joneses,
disease.
the scholars, the Asiatic Society people. They were collecting information about peaks, and they actually could see peaks. They could actually see it from Bihar.
Half West Bengal will come and lynch you for saying William Joneses of the day. There
I
was
know
only the William Jones.
the William Jones or the
Yeah.
Asiatic Society, but apparently there were people who could from Bhagalpur see the peaks of the Himalayas. I just can't comprehend that.
Yeah,
I mean,
so
is it really possible?
there is a reason why there was a doubt whether Mount Everest is actually as tall. I mean, there were doubts about its height because Francis' young husband, one of the British officers who one of the first ones to go to Tibet, wrote this lovely line about Mount Everest. Mount Everest, for its size, is a singularly shy and retiring mountain. It hides itself away behind other mountains. On the north side, in Tibet, it does indeed stand up proudly and alone, a true monarch among mountains. But it stands in a very sparsely inhabited part of Tibet, and a very few people ever go to Tibet. From the Indian side, only its tip appears amongst a mighty array of peaks, which, being nearer, look higher.
So there were so many of these competing peaks. And remember, the especially when you're in somewhere in Missouri and you're trying to take your observations. There is always cloud cover. Cloud cover is the enemy of the surveyor, and you have to wait for that opportune time when they clear out, and then you can actually look at uh, the peaks and their measurements. By this time, you also had better instruments like barometers, where you could actually physically independently ascertain the height on which you were stationed at. So there was Nanda Devi, there was Kanchenjunga, there was K2, all of these, interesting, uh, you know, observations that were made by, by the Survey of India officers and their computers. But there was a consensus evolving that all of these peaks were at least 29,000, 28,000 plus 28,500 was a kind of accepted number feet. And it was already without doubt, but these were taller than the ones in the Andes. And I guess over time they just concluded that it was the Nanda Devi which was the tallest peak in India.
So, Jacob, it was Everest's successor, Andrew Wog, who began the work on Northwestern Himalayan series. It was the longest series between measured bases in the world, roughly 1,690 miles from Dehradun base to Purnia in Bihar. It was originally intended to be drawn along the Himalaya mountains, but the Nepalese government refused to allow the operations to enter their territory. So, after crossing the hills of Garhwal and Kumaon, the triangles were brought down into the Terai near Bareilly, whence they continued to pass through the deadly tracts of marsh and jungle which fringe the Himalayas. And several surveyors lost their lives in this journey. In 1848, Waugh joined the men to measure the height of the Himalayas. Of the five officers who hid the charge of the sea, who led the charge of the series at different times, two retired, and two of them fell victims to the climate. And of course, countless Indians whose names have never been recorded, working as coolies, helpers, died
And I
in
find
the
that a very
process.
glaring omission, because even in all the books that we have read in Key, I mean, it's a great book, but there is almost no mention of how did they recruit people into, coming on these dangerous kinds of expeditions? Why would people even sign up for
I guess there's a book there.
activity like
I
this?
guess there's a book there to be written from an Indian perspective and bringing in Indian voices.
And I shall leave that onerous task to your capable hands, Shobana.
No way, Jacob. But here, since we are almost there and you've been itching to tell the story, please talk to us about the computers of Calcutta.
Actually mentioned the great computer in our previous episode on the India Meteorological Department. So there is Radhanath Sikdar. He was this 20-year-old Bengali genius, as Everest called him that. I mean, can you imagine that? He was the guy who actually despised everything that moved, but he kind of, alluded to him as a genius. He really loved his, mathematical abilities. So he was, I believe, the highest ranked Indian, to be working in the survey of India. And he had risen up the ranks fairly quickly because of his computing abilities. So there are all these stories that, actually it was Radhanath Sikdar, who had first correctly computed and proved that it was Everest that was then called as Peak 15. I mean, it was written in the Roman style of Peak XV. That Peak XV was the highest among all of the, Himalayan peaks. But it doesn't seem to be very accurate. He said the story is that, he ran into a room and all those things. But no, he was sitting far away in Calcutta. He was just amid sheafs of paper. He was a computer
Yeah.
computing data.
So this was, we have to specify the year. This was 1852. And George Everest is retired, already settled in England. It is his successor, Andrew Waugh, who's sitting in Dehradun. And our hero, Ramnath Sikdar, is sitting in Calcutta.
And yeah, and that's where he's sitting in computing, and he gave this data, and I'm sure it must have taken days for him to actually physically transmit this information to War. And uh, and remember, there's this whole background where people are contesting the actual, whether these Himalayan peaks are actually as high as they claim. But by this time, there was a lot of converging evidence, and over time, War finally made this report that, he seems to be pretty convinced, as were the other minds of the day, that this peak XV was indeed the highest peak, not only in the Himalayas. It towered nearly 3,000 feet above the Nanda Devi peak, which is the highest mountain in India, and but it was also the tallest peak in the world. And then comes that interesting thing about the naming. I mean, remember, Everest is not really concerned about Himalayan peaks. As you've said, he's happily retired away. He's had his 6 children. He's this general pleasant man, I'm sure, in England too. He has his daily prayers and he pontificates to all his children and his extended family about the his his travels in India, I
Yeah.
guess,
Going up, back in my day, I went up the
and the
mountain both
suspicious native
ways.
minds. So he's talking about all of
Anyhow.
that.
So,
And it's not that everybody really loved him. Even the British government, he was like this insufferable guy, but who got stuff done, and he was not particularly liked even by the establishment. But even so, it was War who kind of recommended, right? That it was
That's what I'm
he called.
saying. See, this is the great thing about the Great Trigonometrical Survey. All the subordinates seem to be devoted to their bosses. Everest, for all his, the cantankerous nature, was spoke so highly about Lambton and spoke so lovingly and endearingly about Lambton. Similarly, 1852, we had left our story in 1852 when Sikdar finally computes the height, but it takes another 3 years for this to be made official. Waugh presents the findings to the Royal Geographical Society on May 12th, 1857, and 3 days later, it is reported in the press in London that the the height of the Everest is 29,000 feet, 29,002 feet, which is 8,840
And it has been
meters.
revised multiple times since then, but always about
Yeah,
29,000.
roundabout. For 13 years after it was found to be the highest mountain in the world, Peak 15 uh, had no officially accepted name. Uh, when we say officially accepted name, we are actually talking from a very European
Colonial
perspective.
perspective,
Yeah,
yeah.
very colonial perspective. Of not no officially accepted name as per them. Okay, of course, this peak had its name. This peak was seen. It was not discovered by the white man alone. But anyhow, in 1865, at the suggestion of Andrew Waugh, Surveyor General of India, it was named after his immediate predecessor, Sir George Everest. And this, while naming it after his predecessor, Waugh had made the claim that no man before or since had done as much for the geography of Asia, and it would seem a fitting tribute that his name should be attached to the highest of the great peaks, since his methods helped to survey it.
But this wasn't quickly and easily accepted by the government. I mean, they accepted the fact that this was the highest peak in the world, but there were doubts. There were doubts precisely because, would it be appropriate to actually give it a completely new name?
Yeah, this was
Would there be local names?
this was a scandalous appropriation.
Yeah. In fact, there were names like, there was, in fact, there was this name called K2, and people heard of names like K2 and K2, but actually they were just corruptions of K2 in instant. They actually considered calling it Mount Albert. There was even a Mount War, by the way. They even considered calling it Mount War.
But the Chinese, and it was known for a very long time that the Chinese called it Cha Mu Lang Ma, the residents of that
And Brian
area.
Hodgson, an eminent Buddhist scholar who had resided at Kathmandu for some years, he came up with the name Devadanga as the Nepali designation for this name.
And interestingly, Jacob, you will love to hear this, that your uh, uh, the man that you much adore, George Everest himself, was not keen on the idea. In 1857, at a meeting of the Royal Geographical Society where this issue was being discussed, he said that while he found it gratifying, yet he must confess there were objections to his name being given to this mountain, which did not strike everybody. One was that his name was not pronounceable by the native of India. The name could not be written in Persian or Hindi, and the natives would probably not accept it. He was in a delicate position. While he did not wish to offend his devoted followers in the survey, he knew that to give his name to an Asian mountain could create an unwelcome precedent. The official policy so far was that the mountains should be given the name by which they are known locally. And this policy was strongly supported by the leading geographical societies of the world.
So, in fact, the name Devadanga was almost going to happen. But it was here that, War actually objected. He convened a meeting where he actually declared Devadanga as indefinite and unacceptable, in his own words. His logic was that even though this was a name that was there in Nepal legend, it was probably a name that could be applied to several peaks, and it did not mark out number 15 as the world's highest. And plus, War had already named it, and this it was already started being called Mount Everest in the informal British circles. The word was catching on. It had probably made it to the newspapers, etc. And you mentioned that very interesting, the date on which it was done, right? May 3rd, but the year, it was 1857.
Yes,
And there was this other big concern that had actually taken over the British,
the mutiny.
the mutiny of 1857, or as the patriots among us would call it, the First War of Independence,
Yeah, the Great Rebellion.
the Great Rebellion. And obviously, this was such a big task. I mean, here was a body blow challenge to the existence of the empire. And obviously, attention had dramatically shifted away from, oh, what should we call this particular name? And here they were battling with, whether they're going to stay over in India or
Yeah,
not.
but the British entitlement and the sincerity with which they believed in their own righteousness is reflected in this quote by Sir Francis Young husband. He said, "It would be a great misfortune if the beautiful and suitable name of Mount Everest was ever changed, even though it is actually the name of late honored." By then, this man was dead. He was talking in 1921. Even though it is actually the name of the late and honored surveyor general and not a native name, even if the proposed expedition, this is just around the time that the British were finally trying to scale the Everest for the first time, finds its real name written clearly upon the mountain. I hope it will take no notice, as I'm sure you will agree that no name is so beautiful and suitable as Mount Everest.
Oh my God, how
So the man
sentimental.
is saying that even if you had plastered a different name on the top of the mountain, on the face of the mountain, please ignore, because the name Mount Everest is the
Is
most
there? It's just there.
beautiful.
It is like the best name.
Yeah. So,
So
what?
in a way, it's kind of caught on, but of course, that delicious irony always remains. How we started out this episode, right?
No, 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 no. Before you conclude, I just want to quote one line from this book that I recently read for this episode called The Everest written by Walt Unsworth. He writes, "One wonders how the story would have developed had Sir George Everest been called Sir Cuthbert Shufflebottom instead. Perhaps even War would have been less than keen on Mount Shufflebottom."
Absolutely. And to me, the irony still remains, and this is the way we started this whole episode, that Everest was peeved at being called Everest or Compasswala and insisted that he be called Everest. But 99.9999% of the world, except for the dedicated listeners of this podcast, continue to call him by that mispronunciation. And I guess in one way, it's a kind of the revenge against
Yeah,
George Everest.
yeah. All the people that he heard during his lifetime.
Continue to remember
Yeah,
him in this way.
yes.
So that's how, Shobna, over 2 episodes, we have actually scaled the tallest mountain in the world. It's been quite a journey.
And traversed through the plains of
Yeah.
India.
And I guess I would take back some of my initial hesitations about trekking and mountain climbing. It was a fun journey, and thank you for climbing this mountain with us.
Thank you for coming along. That's all we have for today. We shall see you next time very soon.
Bye.